Hey, welcome back to episode 45 of the Information Revolution. I don't have an exciting piece of trivia this time, but it's exciting that we got to 45 episodes. Every time I'm like, great, suddenly it's going to be 50, suddenly it's going to be 55. I think it'll all sound momentous from here on in, so let's enjoy it. Um, let's do the round of the names. Yep, so my name is Michael Upton, and I'm an information management consultant in Wellington, New Zealand.
I'm Judi Vernau, and I'm an information architect based in Wellington, New Zealand.
I'm Karl Melrose. I'm an information and records management consultant, depending on what week you talk to me, based out of Adelaide in Australia.
And I'm Adrian Kearns. I'm a solution architect based in Wellington.
Brilliant. And we're very excited to have Adrian back again to have another round.
I'm trying to work out what I did wrong last time to be invited back.
Very
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Nice. Adrian and I ran into each other, Wellington being Wellington, during the week, and I was saying that one of the things from the last episode that I'd actually already applied in my day job was the distinction. We had a conversation that I think you initiated, Carl, around an engineer and an architect and the kinds of problems that those types of sort of roles naturally gravitate towards. And it really struck me that, in my day job, I often run into people who really do have that engineering mindset of basically, please give me a well specified problem and I will go and deliver on that thing. And I will not ask you whether or not it's the right thing to do or where that fits in the context of the organization or any of those other things. And that sounds quite cheeky, but that's the direction. And it did make me realize I do think with an architectural mindset a lot of the time. I'm often thinking about, where are all these value judgments? Where are the shades of grey? And that's where I spend a lot of my day. So, yeah.
I mean, I think just, to riff on that just for 1 second as well, too. I mean, what I've often found is that architects, deal with the, are we doing the right thing and what are the ways we can make it happen? But I've often found that I can have better performance-oriented conversations with engineers, as in, we have all of these rate problems here and we need to find an optimum way through those things to hit all of these sorts of objectives. I've often found I can have a better conversation about that with an engineer than I can with an architect, because I feel like architects are often operating a level above. And, that was one of the things that prompted the question. And I mean, Adrian, I felt like you hit those things too, in the discussion last week. So it's great for me too, really helped me think about some things.
Yeah, and I mean, architects aren't a monochromatic blob. Like, not every architects don't all think and act the same way. Some are quite practical. Some have a different focus. So
some are quite practical, some less so.
Well,
I was being careful there.
I take your point. I mean, I completely get it. I mean, we're talking about tendency. We're not talking about. I think we're talking about tendency. We're not talking about prescription. This is what an engineer is.
Direction of travel, even.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's it too. Statement of intent.
Nice.
Statement of intent, vision, setting the vision. It's quite funny. Just on that, because I used to think that was. Am I allowed to say wanky on your podcast?
I don't know. We'll find out next week.
Yeah.
Apple might shut us down, but that's okay.
I always thought that word applied when sometimes you'd see someone and they talk about setting the vision, and it would feel quite wanky. But I realised that is one of the things that you have to do, and you can try and make it more practical. And I think it's a really good thing to do. Try and be pragmatic and practical, but you do have to give a direction, and it very much is a thought leadership role. And so you do have to paint a picture for people. You don't have to have like a slide that says, this is the vision for the solution. You can be a bit more understated than that, but it is something that you have to do.
I mean, thought leadership and almost like negotiating which, what thought is going to work in the organisation, so that you don't outrun your organisation. I've often found that that's the, there's kind of the thought out here that we'd love to get to, but there's the one back here that is possible in the organisation we're in now with the people we've got.
Yeah.
And which one of those you optimise for?
Absolutely. We had an engagement. We were doing an integration strategy for a firm, and we sort of had these two options on the table, and one was sort of the more traditional sort of service bus, product-based sort of an approach. It was kind of fairly run-of-the-mill. Not that that was bad. And then the other one was more microservices and REST APIs and all the modern stuff. And clearly that was going to be much more of an ask in terms of the engineering shift that they needed to make, because we would be introducing all these new technologies, and they were going to have to do a step change anyway. But it was already going, an order of magnitude more. And I remember talking with the integration lead who I was doing with, I was like, I mean, our preference is kind of for that one for these reasons, but do you think that they're up to it? I mean, is that going to be something that's a stretch too far? And we talked about it and came to the conclusion that no, we'd shoot for it. And it seems to have panned out well. I haven't been involved with the hands-on, and there have been hiccups, but it's worked out. But it'd be interesting to run two parallel universes and just sort of see how it played out. But yeah,
It's the problem,
completely a
isn't it?
concern. Yeah, the
You got to play
flash
all
is
stuff with live ammunition. It's all judgment. It's judgment all the way down. And
absolutely.
but I mean, I think what you've just described there too is super relevant to records programs, because I think often we come in and we say, well, it's the law, and we say now we're going to implement it because it's the law, without realizing that it's kind of like let's implement this high maturity thing in a low maturity organization, and it will fail because it's a high maturity thing. But people don't feel like they have the option of a pragmatic mid step that goes from nothing to something achievable rather than nothing to something unachievable. I
Yes.
think that the transition architectures, one of us was mentioned that last time. I think that just that concept of transition architectures, and this is what's feasible now, and maybe this is the long-term vision. So if we have to make longer-term choices, we're going to make them in that direction, even if that's not what we're going for in the short term. I feel like lots of records programs could really gain from that type of thinking, because it really does wash what the organisation wants up against what we're trying to do.
Do you find that in your space you do much in the way of strategy? Thinking just about the records management information stuff that you do?
Yeah, in the sense that within an organization, it's normally expected that you have some kind of an information strategy, and it might be a data and information, it might be data information analytics, it might be, or it might just be a straight up records strategy, depending on how people want to scope it and what their point of focus is. Yeah.
And within the scope of that, are you able to do sort of the transitional sort of steps, or sort of pick achievable goals and work towards a sort of the
So
more the long term?
yeah, I think if I were to echo some of what Carl's just said, I think the ones that I've often seen, it's like, oh yeah, this is the thing that we must complete. And therefore it typically will articulate an ideal state that basically is about compliance and a common, even if it's not, it's commonly not really tailored to the organization. It really, you could almost just have that sense of like, oh, well, I know what this is going to say without reading it once I've read a few in my time,
Mm.
because it doesn't necessarily speak to the context of the organization or even their priorities sometimes. But it's absolutely a possible thing, and I've definitely seen it done for sure. Yeah. And for example, that might be, and this is like, yeah, an example might be that, thinking of something you said last time, Adrian, you talked about how, for instance, an enabling technology might not be in place that allows you to then do a certain thing. So you might have a customer facing thing, but you haven't figured out your identity management for their customers. And so you don't really know how you're going to do that. And an example in our world might be something around the governance and, saying, well, actually, we're not clear who actually owns what or who has what responsibilities or how we interact with each other and who has the rights to make what decisions. And if we can't articulate those things, then, um, then you might get pretty unstuck pretty fast, or stuck pretty fast, one or the other. And so in a strategy, you might say, well, okay, number one, sort of first horizon, if we're being fancy sounding, our first horizon might be that we're going for governance, and then the next one might be something around an architecture. Yeah.
A bit of advice. Well, I thought, in the spirit of trying to get away from
Advice is
the
good.
yeah, in the spirit of trying to get away from wanky strategy. So I started having to do some strategy work, and when I did some research on, okay, well, what's in a good strategy? Because I'd seen lots of long waffly ones,
Mm.
and there's a guy, I forget his name. It's on the Wikipedia page for strategy. Is it Rumfeld or something like that? And
Rummelt.
there you go. So you can
He
probably
wrote Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which is an excellent book.
right, yes. So he said basically a strategy has a kernel of three parts. So the first is the diagnosis. Second is what the policies are that you're going to implement, and the third is an action plan of actually putting them in place. And so I've always tried to stick to that when I'm doing any strategy work. So the diagnosis is looking at, like strengths and weaknesses, like what's the problem you're actually there to solve, obviously being the top one, and just trying to root the strategy as much as practically possible and what's actually there and for real in front of you, make it as real and as tangible as possible. And then developing policies, meaning, ideas that will address the issues or the opportunities that you've uncovered in the diagnosis. And a policy can be quite short. Could be like two sentences. It doesn't have to be screeds. Keep it really, really tight. And then the action plan is, okay, we're going to implement that policy by doing these things. And if you can get to the end where you've written out some policies and you can map those very clearly to your diagnosis, and then you've got an action plan which looks like that would actually be feasible and doable against the policies, well, then you've got a strategy that you can implement. If you can't
Mm.
work out an action plan for the policies, well, then that's not where you want to be, right? So if you can get all the way to the end, I mean, it's a good recipe, I think, for coming up with a useful strategy.
It sounds like a really good approach, I must say, because a lot of the strategies I've seen have been a bit motherhood and apple pie, kind of, this is where we want to get to. Whoa, but nothing, but a lot less about how you get there, and very kind of high level. We want to value our information and store it properly, and manage it properly, and blah blah blah, but not those action points. So I think what you're
Mm.
saying is spot on.
Yeah, and if you can and make things testable.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a
Test-driven
statement like,
strategy, right? How do we measure this thing? I mean,
Yeah,
I keep seeing that too. It's the where do the strategic objectives for the organisation's records program come from? Well, they come from the archive, and the archive tells us this is what records are for. And so we're going to implement a strategy to do that thing that they said is important to the archive. We're not going to come into the organisation and diagnose the organisation's and say,
Yeah,
where is our organisation suffering because the quality of our evidence doesn't meet the needs of a business that's trying of a business, and whether an agency, whatever it is, that's trying to effectively serve a public, be efficient at doing it so that it doesn't waste taxpayer money, all of those kinds of things. We don't do the diagnosis. We just go straight into the the audit report from whatever said non-compliant, and therefore we need the document that says we're going to be compliant if you spend this money,
because
and the strategic will just isn't there.
because one approach could be, okay, let's come up with a way to measure data quality for something. That could be how information's
hmm
tagged or classified or whatever. And so, okay, so the goal of this policy is to try and improve our overall data quality by 5% within the next 2 years. I mean, it could be something really modest, but if you could achieve that, then that might unlock further steps. Start
Mm.
modest. To your point.
But it's virtuous cycles. Diagnosis to me, if you're gonna go into an organization and you're going to do a diagnosis that can result in an actual execution of a strategy, your diagnosis has to be a diagnosis of problems that are meaningful for the organization. And I mean, I think, and I don't think I would be alone in this. I think if I just said that the diagnosis of not compliant with, the Records or the Archives Act or whatever you've got in your jurisdiction. I mean, if that was something that moved an agency, I think it'd have moved agencies by now. It just hasn't.
Yeah,
And,
sure.
the things that are
I mean, I
moving
think,
organisations at the moment are privacy. We've got all this PII and we don't know where it is, what it is, how long we're supposed to keep it for, or anything like that. I mean, that's moving lots of organisations at the moment. Sorry, Michael. I keep forgetting you can talk this week.
yeah, my lag is gone. Well, touch wood. Um, I think it does come back to something we talked about last time, which I found really valuable again, which was about identifying the right problem to solve.
Mm,
And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's at the heart of diagnosis, right? It's that idea of saying, well, what's the actual problem here? And I think I mean, that's a thing that I always come back to when, and sorry, I've probably said this a million times, but you know, we're coming at things from several different angles. But uh, uh, normally, if there is some compliance measure in place, then it's there for a reason. And so, if we can actually point to the spirit of the law rather than the letter, and say,
absolutely.
well, what's the purpose of this thing, and then go, well, and how does that relate to us? Like in terms of, you know, being able to achieve a certain sort of purpose, like is that actually a problem rather than sort of I don't know, some kind of more specific metric. But I guess then the challenge is to then make that testable. But I mean, I think fundamentally it just does come back to more of that sort of spending time on listening, on understanding, on asking curly questions to try and sort of understand the problem before continuing.
Yeah, I mean, the more you can root it in a way that the business will understand, or use their language,
Mm,
the more real you can make it for them, the more chance you'll get.
yeah.
And the other idea that occurs to me is, someone once said of the news that the news doesn't tell you what to think, but it does tell you what to think about. And I think when you're doing architecture or you're thinking architecturally, you have to take a step back from what things people are saying and how they've framed the problem, and then try and think, well, is there a better way to frame it? Just going right back to first principles, and maybe reframe it if you need to. Just not just following the path that everyone's already on.
mm. I mean, two things that this whole conversation's really brought up for me, and one of them is that the repeating pattern that I keep seeing in records management is the standard practice pattern that is functional classification and compliant records management system and all of these kinds of things. And I had dinner with one of the real kind of giants of the records industry and standards and everything else last week. And it was just interesting. We just had this little moment conversation where she just said, one of the things that drive, and I'm completely paraphrasing and probably imprinting my own values, but this is what stuck with me. It was just that it drives her crazy that there is so much practice without thought. There is so much, people don't wrestle with how to implement things, what to implement, how to do the work. It's just the same pattern everywhere. And I mean, that for me has just been something that I keep seeing over and over again. There's this mindless implementation of this thing, whether it destroys the results that the organization is trying to get to or not. And that to me, if you roll out, and I know I keep back, I've got to come up with a better stalking horse for this. I really do, because I bash functional classification way too much. But if you
We may have heard
restructure,
it a couple of times.
Yeah,
oh,
once or
I know I'm
twice, I
becoming
think.
repetitive. I need a different one. But if you restructure a repository functionally, and utilization of that repository goes from 98% down to 5%, then I don't care what you say about the long-term value of functional classification. You have screwed it up, and you have made things worse for your organization. And we have to get that reality into our heads as an industry, because organizations just go, yeah, okay, you want to do that, that's nice, we're going to go and do everything over here. And then we failed all of the good things that really should come out of records practice. I mean, records practice should be a source of strategic power. You go and look at so much of history, and so much of history is built on records. You know, we recorded things, and then the whole world became manageable and understandable, and we could operate in it effectively, and we could regulate, and we could produce public good. And then I see what so much of practice, and I can't see that in the way we do it. The other thing though too is that, you know, in organizational diagnosis, you know, it's this idea of you know, salvation versus revelation. So much of the problem that we have within our organizations is that when we come along with a diagnosis, we're trying to tell them how it's going to solve all of their, we're trying to say, here's the thing and it's going to solve all of your problems, instead of just coming along and helping them see the pattern. Because so much of what underlies organizational information failures to me is this recurring pattern of, you know, we had this failure over here and this failure over here and this failure over here, and we've got this business unit that's consuming 50% more resources than it should. And you know what? The problem for all of them is that they can't find the things that they should be relying on to do their work. And it's that if you can reveal that underlying pattern to people, you know, that the rest just becomes a race to, you know, God, how can we run in that direction? Because now that I can see it, I can't unsee it. And I found that idea of, you know, what are we aiming for with diagnosis? It's not salvation, it's revelation, really effective. And thinking back on, you know, there's a local CIO here in Adelaide, and just thinking about how he operates, you know, it's straight that all the conversations we've had about, you know, the process he goes through in organizations is he helps people see the problems, you know, wanders around the organization and collects problems. And then when it gets to the point where, you know, there's so many problems and he's built so much consensus around the problems so that people can't not see them anymore, then you can't help but act. And, you know, I mean, that's real power too. There's real fuel there for a strategy once you've got that kind of consensus built, and people are almost in pain because now they can see, you know, all of these things that aren't working right.
And
So
sometimes it might just be that they can see it, but they're unable to articulate it or conceptualize it in a way that they can then act on.
yeah,
or
that's true.
feel that they have no part to play in changing things.
Hmm. Adrian, I'm curious, in terms of Karl talking about what we might describe as sacred cows of the profession, and you know things that, or you know, maladaptive behaviours, things that haven't served us, you know, recently. I guess I'm interested in architecture. There's similar things. As for instance, I mean, I remember when I first learned about enterprise architecture, everyone talked about TOGAF. Is TOGAF a thing? Is it?
TOGAF's the thing.
Yeah.
It's a tool, and like all tools, it can be used in the right place and in the wrong place.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if I'm not quite sure what things architects commonly do, which would be what did you call it?
Maladaptive.
Oh,
Maladaptive.
Sorry, that's
Um,
like pop psychology stuff. It's like when, as a kid, you learn the thing that basically puts you on a bad path.
yeah, I mean it's like, you know, anti patterns and bad practices and stuff. And there's all that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of the usual candidates emerge, like, you know, people following process for process sake, or being dazzled by technology, that kind of thing. I think one for architects is, you know, not talking to the people that you need to. So it might be not engaging with the business or the right people in the business correctly, or, you know, working with the project team. Um, and there's lots of traps there, particularly doing solution architecture, where you're trying to pull together a wider solution that encompasses a number of applications, and involves business processes, and, you know, from all over the place. And you often get lots of problems where the only way to solve it is to basically, you're herding cats, not just amongst technical teams, but sometimes across business teams or across both. And so a lot of the job is really, you know, human interaction, and trying to, you know, herding cats, you know, herding people. You know, so if you've got a particular stakeholder that you don't really like, or is hard to get hold of, or are difficult to work with, that's just something that you need to overcome to get the right stuff sort of fleshed out so that you can move on. So So one of the traps I think is people being sucked into what feels comfortable rather than what actually needs to be done. So that's one. I actually did a blog post and a podcast, a Geekle presentation. There's this conference called Geekle, and I did one on four traps that solution architects sometimes have. But I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, so don't ask me. But it should be easier to find online.
I'll make sure it's in the show notes.
Yes, brilliant. But yeah, those are the. I was going to say malapropisms, but that's not right. The malapropisms that come to mind. And I guess the key danger is for architects is that if you're too far removed from reality is probably a wee bit is far too condescending and too strong. Not what I mean, but
But
if
it's an abstraction. Too many
yes,
abstractions away.
yes. Well, and that's better. Yes, if you're too many abstractions away, then there's a danger that you're solving a theoretical problem and not a practical one. Or it's very easy to be off target. So.
I'm interested to a lot of what you mentioned there is about influencing and consensus building, and I'm really interested in how you learnt those skills over your career. Is it a formal process or is it just something you did, something that made sense to you?
More of the latter. I mean, the only course that I know of is in the School of Hard Knocks, kind of to throw that metaphor out there again. So I'm not sure how different people and different personality types go with that kind of thing. I mean, I know what works for me. I'm I don't know to what extent those same techniques would work for other people. But generally, trying to be empathetic and really listen to people. You might have heard the line about a good listening is not listening to respond; it's listening to understand. Um, so really, you're trying to empathise with people and understand the problem from their perspective. So that's really
Mm.
really essential. Um, what was the actual question you asked? Because I've gone off on a tangent, but I've actually lost.
No, but it was an on-topic tangent, so well played.
I know it
Uh,
was, but I'm at the end of that rope, so I thought I'll just check in.
and root us back in the lower abstraction. Um, it was really just thinking about, and I guess this is a question for everyone on the call. I mean, the ability to influence in an organization is so important for getting anything done. And I think it's important for all of us. But I mean, Adrian, I think, the comment you've constantly made comments about building consensus and, taking people on the journey and some of those kinds of things. And so I feel like it's been emphasized in the discussion with you. And I guess I'm just thinking about where can people in particularly the records management industry, which I think is struggling a bit for at the moment. I mean, where can people learn those skills or how have you learnt those skills so that people can take some of that stuff as a bit of a model about how to think about these sorts of problems?
Well, one interesting technique which I stumbled on is I realised that you can still learn stuff from people even if you don't necessarily respect them or like them. So
And learnt this lesson too.
Absolutely.
yeah, there was a boss I had, and he wasn't that brilliant. I think he thinks he was a lot more brilliant than he actually was, or at least from where I was sitting. But you could still learn stuff from him, things that he did and that worked well for him and that got certain results, or things that he did poorly and how that reacted. Like, okay, I've now learned that I shouldn't do things that way. So, so learning from other people's, I think something that we probably all do. So that's something I'm
Mm-hmm.
always trying to be very careful of is looking at how other people do things. Maybe quizzing them sometimes. Oh, so why did you do it that way? Or just trying to understand.
In terms of thinking about influencing or how to learn about influence, I think one of the things I've found really helpful, I feel like I'm definitely in pop psychology land today, but to go back there again, people talk about that idea of a growth mindset, and I'm sure I learned this on a sales course. So um, probably quite far from a lot of sort of traditional information people. But I guess telling myself that I can learn to do whatever the thing is that I need to, basically, if I want to. I guess one thing I see as a generalization in information professions is that people would lean towards, saying things like, oh, but I'm an introvert, or I prefer to be sort of back office, or, I want to work on my system and make sure it's nice. And that can go to the extreme of, and therefore I could never be influential. I could never change how I am now, basically. And I think if you can uh, just trust that you could learn that if you wanted to. You could change, and that, as you say, Adrian, a lot of it is actually just school of hard knocks. Is actually just paying attention and observing what others do, and even talking to those people and saying, "Hey, you know, you're my buddy who I trust, and I would like to be better at this thing, and can you help me?"
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Muscle memory for me, though, too. I
Mm.
mean, that's the thing that if I think about, I worked in sales for a long time. And if I think about some of the things that's given me, and then if I think about some of the elements of, the sort of master's study that I'm in now as well, it really is, it really has helped me recognize that I think there's lots of times where there is a meaningful problem that needs to be solved. And then we tell ourselves a story so that we don't have to deal with that. And I think that, an essential part for an essential thing for anybody who wants to lead. And fundamentally, if we're talking about consensus building and those kinds of things, I mean, we are talking about leading a group of people, because once you've changed the way they make sense of the world, you have changed the way they act in the world. And so, that is fundamentally an act of leadership.
Yeah.
You really are leading at that point. And, I think telling ourselves a different story, that, this is meaningful work and it's important and we must be effective. And if we aren't effective, I'm going to leave my ego at the door, and I'm going to go and ask people about, look, I was expecting this would happen. It hasn't happened. Why is that? How can we change? Maybe I think it's even beyond a growth mindset at that point. I think it's really just about curiosity and indulgence of curiosity and
And
leaving
being
some of that
humble as
to
well, I
the
think.
Yeah.
Being humble and
Yeah.
acknowledging what you know and what you don't know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, in terms of particular techniques that I've learned, so one is, to do, don't try and be the smartest person in the room. So, I'll frequently defer to other people as much as I can, because when you involve someone else and you give them space to contribute, that really helps win people over. Um, so, if I'm dealing with someone who I know is going to be key in working through a problem or involved in the delivery, if they're quite a difficult personality, I'll spend a lot of time and a lot of effort really trying to work with them. So I'll give them more latitude and more leeway than perhaps I would for someone else, as long as I think that's not going to be taken advantage of and I'm going to be hurt by it. But give really involve people, and that's really good for building bridges, because that's what you're really trying to do. You're trying to build bridges with different people or different teams, trying to find allies, trying to find common ground that you can then build from. So even if you disagree about some things, you might still have some common things that you can work together, build up some trust. And that's just a simple first step, is just trying to build up just a little bit of trust with someone. Um,
Mm,
uh, and I find particularly when you're dealing with technical stuff, and you'll have tech leads or developers who know a lot about stuff. I'll be the first to say to them, look, like, I know some stuff about this, but you're the experts. We're going to be doing this together. I'm going to be leaning on your expertise. I'm not going to be coming in and telling you what we should do. I'll set some constraints and help guide you, but very much working with you. You can have got a lot of latitude. And if you think I'm going in the wrong direction, let me know, and we'll if we need to change that, we can do that, and try and make it clear to people that you're willing to work with them. try and give them some boundaries to work within, but give
Mm.
them as much room as you can.
These are the outcomes. These are the boundaries.
Yes,
Let's work out how to work within them.
absolutely. And I mean, that's another problem you were talking about. You know, the male thing before. People always walk around with solutions. Well, it's like, well, tell us what the problem is, and we can figure out what the solution is. It goes back to asking the 5 whys. You want to put it in
Mm,
that
mm.
solution. Why do you want to put it in that solution?
I mean, it's also the salvation and revelation thing too. We want to come in and solve the problem for people and tell them the answer without recognizing that, if we can help them see the problem that we see, and actually, and hopefully it is actually a problem that they believe in, they will want to work with us on it. We won't have to push them and force them and have the right answer anymore, because they will drive us to get the answer together.
Absolutely.
And fundamentally, people don't want to feel dumb, so they don't want you to come in and be like, "Hey, look at me, I'm really freaking smart, and look at my genius idea." That's not going to win most people over.
No,
There's
quite.
a certain amount of demonstrating credibility or whatever, but often, the whole show don't tell. Like, often you don't want to do that by giving someone a heroic speech from the mountain.
So hard to let go of that ego impulse, though, too. And I mean,
Mm,
particularly I think particularly in an industry, like records management, which has been, and I know I keep saying this, but I mean, I really feel it. I feel like we have been downtrodden for a while, and I think those moments that are, where we're proven right. I think it's really, really hard to let go of, to let other people have that moment.
mm,
Mm. The one other idea that technique that I sometimes use is I'll ask someone a question, but I already know the answer. So I'm not asking them because I want them to tell me what their answer is, because I don't know. I'm kind of asking because I want to see what they think about it. Um, so there's a number of ways that you might do this. One is you want to verify that what you know is actually correct. But another way is it just gives them an opportunity to talk about the problem as they understand it. So we had I was in a meeting with, I was coming onto an engagement, so we already had some people working on this at a more junior level. And I think I was coming in to sort of assist. And we had a meeting with the client. So there's about 6 people on the call. It was the very first time I was meeting them, and so I asked them. One of my is, as an architect, trying to verify that what I've been told is what actually is the truth, because often they're not. And so I put a question to them, which I kind of already knew the answer to, but I was hoping that might lead to a certain discussion. It would lead to a discussion that would provide some answers and give me clarity about what was going on. Um, and so I asked the question, and before the client could answer, the guy on our side, the more junior guy, stepped in and said, "Oh no, we've already got the answer to this. It's blah," and completely shut it down. And I said to him afterwards, that's I explained why I was asking the question. So so just because you know the answer to something doesn't mean that it's just because you know the answer to a question doesn't mean it's not worth asking.
And the consensus is more important than the answer.
Yes.
And I got a mate of mine, Jeff, who his favourite saying is that, to make a loaf of bread, you've first got to create the universe. And I just I like which
classic Jeff.
I like, but it's one of these little touch points I keep coming back to, because every time you start looking at requirements and those kinds of things, or every time you look at a design problem of any kind, and I'm in the middle of half a dozen of these at the moment. There's how many things how many assumptions are sitting underneath your model that you haven't articulated, that if any one of them is wrong, it breaks your model. And I'm dealing with a bunch of those around some manage in place stuff that I'm doing at the moment, and there are a heap of assumptions sitting under the model, and we're kind of assuming that people get that, and I'm getting more and more uncomfortable as we go, that because I'm realizing that they don't. And for me, that's a problem now, because I've made an assumption that we share assumptions,
Yeah.
And I think if I had have backed up in that process a little bit, I could have done it a little bit better. And now I would not be running back, late in the piece to go, okay, we need to talk about this. And, is this going to,
There's probably
this consequences at this point? Whereas previously, the consequences would have been we have a design discussion.
and there's probably a whole episode in that, because one tendency would be to try and put all the assumptions to bed and to be on solid ground before you go forward. But if you take that approach, you might never ever deliver or do anything. And so at some point you have to.
It's optimizing problems all the way down, right? It's how much of the universe do you take as given before you make your loaf of bread.
Yeah. That's what I thought the kind of, I don't know, that was the immediate bit that spoke to me about that idea, is that, well, we have to assume many, many, many conditions and get on with it. But as you say, there's obviously risk in that. So yeah.
I mean, every abstraction carries risk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, just this podcast carries enormous risk.
Oh no.
The only other thing about strategy that I was thinking before is, I think there was the assumption when I said strategy that it quickly shifted to like organizational strategy, like there'd be an official strategy and
Yeah.
you'd be doing information strategy to that. But the other kind of strategy you might develop might be one that's just internal to the information team. Like how do we do our jobs better as professionals? Like how do we improve our engagement with the business? And so you might come up with your own strategy for your team. It might link in parts back to other strategies, but just come up with a game plan for how you're going to do your own practice.
Nice.
Yeah, diagnosis, policy, action plan, right?
Keep
We've
it
got a
simple.
problem with
Keep it
perception.
really short.
Yeah, we got a problem with perception of the records management team at the moment. So, when we go out to people, our policy now is that we only ever talk about things that produce gains for them in their business processes. Fantastic. Our action plan now is XYZ, and that's our strategy for lifting the.
Yeah.
And
Sounds like a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first strategy might just be to do a diagnosis that we can then develop some policies of. Just doing the diagnosis itself might be the first iteration.
It'll certainly help you see the world differently.
And I guess, one thing I'd call out there is the idea of a strategy is something that could be pretty time bound, and you could pretty much say when you're done. If you've articulated an action plan, presumably the action plan has an end point on it, and then you go, cool, what's next? Whereas I guess something I've always complained about with those, big S organizational strategies is that they're normally so grand. Going back to what you were saying, Judy, that they kind of feel like these monster things that are creating the entire universe, and when are you ever finished? So the idea of a strategy that you might actually execute on and be done with and move to another one, like that's pretty exciting. It's not really
Absolutely.
something I've
Or
even
you
thought
might
about.
have that big grand one, but I think we were saying you'd have your action plan, and then maybe when you've done those, what's your next action plan? It's
Yeah.
not a done thing. It's going to continue on.
And it always, 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 always comes back to what's the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
As long as
Yeah,
the
I like that.
strategy addresses that, then you're onto a winner.
Yeah.
If you've drifted from that, then
Yeah.
What's the problem we're trying to solve, and how many other people's problems did we have to tag onto it along the way in order to get enough support to actually get it implemented?
scope.
Yeah, scope, creep.
Nice one. All right, I'm going to wrap us up. So thanks for coming back in, Adrian, and
Yeah, thank you.
for
It's great.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
Yeah, lots to think about.
all right. We'll catch you all later. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.